Hello, everyone. My name is Pablo Brewer. I'm here to talk to you a little bit about some of the new challenges in using AI to counter misinformation and disinformation. So first, a standard disclaimer that the views I express are those of myself and not necessarily those of my employers. So please keep that in mind as we go through this presentation. So quick agenda first, we'll talk about how artificial intelligence is being used to promote misinformation and conduct misinformation, disinformation. We'll talk about why most of the current discussions about defenses are really dead on arrival and not terribly useful. And then we'll talk about where artificial intelligence might be employed in order to aid us in combating misinformation and disinformation. So let's talk about how AI is being used for misinformation. We'll try to do this using a standard framework. In particular, I would like to use the AMIT framework, the Adversarial Misinformation and Influence Tactics and Techniques framework. I'm not going to get to every link in the kill chain, but I want to talk broadly about the phases that are necessary in order to conduct a misinformation or disinformation attack. And the phases, according to AMIT, are planning, preparation, execution, and evaluation. And just as a slight read ahead or cheat, the colors will tell you how useful AI is, in my estimation, in conducting misinformation attacks under each of those phases. So the first phase is planning. There are two tasks in the planning phase. There's strategic planning and objective planning. And artificial intelligence isn't tremendously useful in planning. And the reason is that while you can use artificial intelligence to track existing trends and narratives, it's not terribly useful for measuring effectiveness at this point because we don't know what we're measuring. We haven't conducted any actions yet. And it's not really suitable for doing a center of gravity analysis against the target. And so if you're conducting misinformation or disinformation attacks, the planning stage is primarily a human endeavor and not really aided by artificial intelligence. The next step is preparation, and preparation is where you get things set up and ready to go to actually execute the attack. And so you start up with your initial network development, and your network development is both people and in some cases bots. And so, sure, artificial intelligence is useful. You can go out and buy data from the social media sites to figure out where your quote unquote useful idiots are. Useful idiots is not my term. It's a term that comes out of Soviet Cold War doctrine. And in their definition, a useful idiot is really a victim. It's somebody that falls for misinformation and helps to propagate or promote it without realizing that they are propagating misinformation. So certainly you can go out there and buy data and figure out who might be susceptible to any particular kind of attack. You're not going to use bots a whole lot at this stage. And the reason you're not going to use bots at this stage is you're just starting to kind of seed the disinformation. And so if you use bots, there's not a whole lot of noise to hide in. And so if you're the attacker and use bots prolifically at this stage, you're going to tip your hand and you're going to reveal where all of your bots are and where your infrastructure is. So that's not going to be very helpful as you move on to execution. Again, micro-targeting, AI is tremendously useful here. The social networks have, or social media networks, I should say, have been custom made for this. They were made to gather information on their users, identify the things that they might be interested in, and provide those insights so that you could sell advertisements. And misinformation and disinformation is advertising. It's just advertising not to sell a service or a product, but it's to create a different kind of effect. Artificial intelligence is great here for doing A/B testing and message honing. You've got 2 or 3 different versions of your message. You can float up trial balloons, rapidly gather data from the social media networks as to what works, what doesn't, and use that to hone your message. It's also good for beginning to develop your content. Surely we've all heard of deep fakes at this point that are enabled by generative adverse networks or GANs. By now, most of us have probably heard of GPT-3, which is, for lack of a better term, a very good chatbot. And so certainly AI can be used to start generating message content for misinformation and disinformation at this point. The last thing that you do in preparation is channel selection, and that really comes down to how are you going to propagate, what channels are you going to use to propagate this misinformation. And this is really more of a social analysis. If you're in the United States, you might use Facebook. If you're overseas somewhere, you might use WhatsApp. So again, AI is not tremendously useful here. So moving on to execution, the first thing you have to do is pump priming. You have to start seeding these bits of misinformation, and AI is of limited use here because you have to choose your targets very carefully. AI can help you choose these targets by helping you identify influencers, but you're not going to use AI to really spread the message at this point for the same reasons you don't do it in preparation. You don't want to tip your hand. You don't want to reveal where your infrastructure is. Now, once the message starts propagating out to the larger masses, this is where AI becomes very, very useful. Now you can use bots and a large number of them to actually re-amplify your message, retweet, like, so forth. And the reason you can do it now is there are other people doing it that aren't part of your bad actor team. And so the bots can now hide in the noise a little bit. We've long since passed the Turing test. The Turing test is, can a computer fool a human being into thinking they're human? We passed that years ago. And so AIs like GPT-3 can and will be used to not only initially send out misinformation, but in some cases respond to human queries and human reactions to that misinformation. The last bit is what Amit calls go physical, and go physical is really getting out of the network world and getting into the physical world by doing things like live protests or selling propagandized products like hats and t-shirts. And AI is not tremendously useful here. However, AI is really good for the marketing bit. And again, you can use this for advertising. That's what the social media networks were designed for. The last bit is evaluation. That's the last phase in the Amit model. In this case, you want to persist. You want your message to persist, and you want to measure effectiveness. So artificial intelligence is of marginal use for persistence. While you certainly can use bots to periodically re-amplify messages to keep it in the current narrative, the reality is that this tactic is well known and it's easily measured. And I will show you how you can see that later on in the slides. Again, that bot use is easily detectable in most cases. Measuring effectiveness. Is your message having the desired effect? AI is tremendously useful here. Again, A/B testing, a rapid evaluation of big data. You're going to get lots of data from social media networks and from the internet, and the AIs are going to be able to take that data and adapt from it, learn from it, and suggest further actions. So after this, you conduct a series of attacks, you wash, rinse, and repeat, and you can start a new series of attacks. So having discussed how AI is used to conduct misinformation, why is it that most of the defensive discussions we've had to counter misinformation have been dead on arrival? First, we have to discuss a couple of cognitive concepts, and I apologize, I'm not a cognitive scientist, I'm a computer scientist, but I'll do my best. So cognitive dissonance is the first topic that we need to discuss. Cognitive dissonance is the psychological stress induced when a person has contradictory beliefs, ideas, or values to an action they're taking or to that information they're seeing. Cognitive friction is the psychological resistance to accept and assimilate new beliefs, ideas, or values. The next one is cognitive ease. The cognitive ease is how fluent is the brain at accepting new beliefs, ideas, and values. And the reason cognitive ease is important is that gets to something called cognitive easing. And cognitive easing is the use of repetition and incremental steps to increase cognitive ease and therefore reduce cognitive friction. And oftentimes in the past, this was called indoctrination, which has a far more nefarious connotation, but there you have it. So most of the defense against misinformation discussions that I've been involved with deal with how do we deal with misinformation after the fact? And there are numerous challenges here. One of the challenges is that misinformation works because it's taken advantage of existing biases in the people receiving the information. If you believe that pineapple belongs on pizza, then me telling you that other fruits belong on pizza is probably going to go over easier than if you're one of the people that believes that, no, the only thing that belongs on pizza is pepperoni. So by taking advantage of these cognitive biases, now if you've seen this misinformation, not only do I have to overcome cognitive friction, I have to overcome cognitive dissonance and the cognitive easing that you got as a result of the misinformation. And oftentimes what this means is we end up with these very polarized views where the left side accuses the right side of fake news claims and not understanding, and the right side accuses the left of the same. And so these usually devolve and are not very productive discussions. The other defense that I hear a lot about is education. Education is great. Certainly the future of our children, but goodness, we cannot wait a generation for our children who are now educated on how to fight disinformation to grow up to vote and make policy decisions. So what do we do with the adults that are already out in the world making decisions? So here are some examples of previous work that has gone on to detect misinformation via the use of bots to reamplify. And I'll just go over these very quickly. Up at the top are two graphs that go over propagation-based detection. So the right-hand graph is legitimate news. And what happens with legitimate news is it's unknown information. It appears via some sort of a channel. People see it, they accept it, it becomes part of the consciousness, and you have a degradation, and then it's just accepted. What happens with unconfirmed news or misinformation and disinformation is you have bots periodically reintroduce that information. And that's why you get the multiple peaks that you get in the left-hand side. Another way to detect misinformation and disinformation after it happens is looking at time-based cascades detection. And so what happens is that because of that periodic reintroduction and reamplification by bots, the false news, that is the red line, ends up having a greater inflection point because it ends up staying in the consciousness longer because it gets periodically reamplified. So it stretches not only further, but it has this inflection point where you can see that it's been reintroduced into the public consciousness. And again, part of the problem with combating misinformation and disinformation in this way is the fact that by the time you gather this data, the people have already fallen victim to this misinformation. So now you've got to overcome this cognitive dissonance and this cognitive easing. So addressing misinformation before the fact, there's been some discussions here, and it's definitely the preferred method. If you can counteract misinformation and disinformation ahead of time, then why wouldn't you? Well, the problem is you can't predict all avenues of attack. So sooner or later, you're going to be reacting to an attack that already happened. The other problem is that you've got to start working on some of those existing biases. So for any given topic, again, if you believe that pineapple belongs on pizza, I've got to overcome that to convince you of the truth that pineapple doesn't belong on pizza. Pineapple actually does belong on pizza. The other problem that we've got, which is a larger problem, is the current methodologies, the current tactics, techniques, and procedures for conducting misinformation and disinformation haven't been around for very long. So we don't have good models. We've got a lack of data to build and train those models. And on top of that, all of this is exacerbated by the fact that we have a shifting landscape. The way that things worked in 2016 are not the way that they work now, nor are they the way they worked in 2012. So we've got to get better and faster at building these models, training these models, and analyzing the data that we have access to. Other ways we've looked at this in the past on the left-hand side is an epidemic diffusion model, and this is something that's used in the medical field to track pandemics and viruses. And so RC is your rate of contact to S the subject, and at some point you go from being contacted to being infected, which is state I. And then at some point, maybe the victim realizes that they've been infected with misinformation, and so there's a correction and you go back to S. The problem is that while this model is very easy to understand and it's very easy to look at, we don't understand enough about how misinformation works to understand what causes the state change? What is the catalyst that causes you to go from I'm being contacted by misinformation to I've now been infected by it? And so a lot more studies needed. On the right-hand side, we've got a depiction of a scale-free network. A scale-free network is a mathematical model that's been used for tracking social networks as opposed to social media networks, actual human social networks in the past. And the challenge here is twofold. First of all, for a scale-free network of any interesting size, it rapidly becomes very hard to discern what's going on. So when you look at that graph, it really is quite difficult to see what's happening or why it's happening. The other problem, and this is a more fundamental one, and again, I'm not a mathematician, is the predominant characteristic of scale-free networks is that links are formed between nodes or people at a much faster rate than they're broken. And if you think about a traditional social network, people tend to have more friends towards the end of their lives than they do at the beginning because they've met more people. They tend to have more business contacts towards the end of a career than they do at the beginning because they've met more people. Unfortunately, what happens with social media is when you've got a connected populace for any given divisive topic, the rate of breaking links, of unfollowing, is far greater than the rate at which you follow new people. And so, to my knowledge, we've not seen, or I've not seen, a math model or a power law that sufficiently explains this phenomenon. And that makes it very hard to build an AI to address disinformation. So now that I talked about what doesn't work or what the challenges are with the things that we've tried, where can AI aid in disinformation defense? How could we look at it? So again, just a quick review of this is what the misinformation phases looked like for the attacker. Let's do the same thing, keeping in mind how the attacker may use AI, and see if we can affect any of these for defense. So planning, if you remember, for the attacker, planning was red, AI wasn't very useful. For defense, it's actually a little bit better. And here's what the difference is. We know what our centers of gravity are. We know what makes us tick. We know what we need to protect. And so we also know for objectives what's critical and what's not critical. And so that allows us to use AI for early warning. We can start to look for that black swan amongst the flock of white swans. The challenge here is that there are far more devices on the internet than there are people of the planet, and the amount of information is just immense, even for an AI. And so there is a chance that we are going to miss an indicator of something that's anomalous. But certainly using an AI for early warning detection has worked well in cyber defense, and it certainly can work well here for misinformation. Preparation phase. Again, it's of some use here. AI can help us identify influencers that might be interested in helping us propagate good messages. It might help us identify influencers that are willing to accept misinformation. Perhaps we can start convincing them of the real information ahead of time. Micro-targeting. Again, if micro-targeting works for bad, micro-targeting works for good. We can certainly go out to the social media networks and ask for information and see who is particularly prone to following misinformation so we can conduct an education and public relations campaign to convince them that mail-in ballots are okay, or that wearing masks for COVID is actually a good defensive mechanism. And again, the AI can be used for A/B testing and for message honing and help us ensure that we get the right messages to the right people in the right ways. Unfortunately, where AI fails us in defense is for content development. If we're going to be the stalwart defenders of truth, the last thing we want is the optics that we're creating fake information. And so using GANs and using chatbots may not necessarily be viewed in the best light. So we're probably not going to be using artificial intelligence in order to create content. And again, for the same reason that channel selection wasn't good use of AI for attack, it's not going to be a good use for defense. Moving forward to execution, pump priming AI is of limited use, again, due to limited targets. This is the same kind of restriction that we had on the attack side. For exposure, there is some limited use of AI for basic fact checking. Some of the challenges here for basic fact checking are that you have to either assume an open world or closed world model, and both of those come with unique challenges. We can use AI, however, for tracking data provenance and knowing who the authoritative and originating source of a piece of information sometimes can lead us to make better decisions about the reliability and the truthiness of that information. Deepfake detection is something that we're just starting to talk about for AI. We've talked about AI for creating deepfakes. We've not talked about AI very much for detecting deepfakes. The current deepfakes are generally perceptively bad. Most people can look at a piece of media, a video, a picture, listen to some audio and say something's not quite right. But those days are rapidly waning. Now, the creation of deep fakes via automation create certain patterns and mathematical anomalies. So if a computer can create these deep fakes, an AI model can certainly be trained to look for these patterns and highlight meaning and go, hey, something's not quite right here. The math doesn't quite work out. There's not enough randomness. The other thing, and this is really interesting, is a few weeks ago, a paper came out that looked for medical anomalies in videos of people. And the medical anomalies it looked for were micro changes in the complexion of the person in the video based upon their heart pumping. So certainly we can train AIs to look for these kind of liveness type techniques that you would see in real people and not necessarily see in AI generated content. And the last bit for the execution is the go physical. Again, AI is not particularly useful for the go physical bit. In evaluation, again, we've got kind of the same pros and cons for defense that we did for offense. AI is not really terribly good for persistence. Certainly we could use bots to re-amplify real messages, and that's great. But again, botnet use is easily detectable, and we've got that problem of perception. If we're putting out the truth, if we're the good guys and good gals, why are we using bots? It is very good still for measuring effectiveness in A/B testing. It's good for rapid assimilation and evaluation of big data, for analysis and message honing. And again, we can use AI to conduct a PR or an information and education campaign, rapidly hone the message, and then conduct the next action to inform the populace. So when we look at the AMIT framework phrases overall and we compare attack to defense, we see something interesting, which is that there is no asymmetric attack advantage. As a matter of fact, they're probably fairly even, and in many cases, the defense actually has the upper hand because they know what they need to protect. Now, we can argue back and forth about this a little bit, but the point here is really that attack doesn't have an asymmetric advantage. We just haven't been very good on the defensive side about leveraging AI to help us because we've not applied it in a systematic way by looking at what does the attacker need to accomplish. So some key takeaways here. Misinformation is really a social problem that is enabled by technology. It is not a technology problem. And so while AI and technology are going to be able to help us enable a defense against misinformation, it's an arms race if we only look at the technology side. We really need some societal things to happen. In order to have AI help us with disinformation and misinformation defense, we're going to need better models so that we can understand why and how disinformation and misinformation work in the current world environment and through social media networks. We're going to need to analyze data so we can train those AIs based upon previous attacks. We are going to have to conduct education, not just for children, but through public service announcements for adults. And realistically, we're going to need some regulation and oversight. The current economic model of social media networks is great for advertising, but I think we can safely discuss now the fact that it's been really hijacked by misinformation and disinformation. And so it probably is time for us to implant some sort of regulation and oversight to keep this from happening over and over again. So with that, that is everything that I have for you today. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope this spurred some discussions. I wish I had more and better answers. If I can be of help or answer any questions, please feel free to reach out. And thank you very much for your time.